A warm welcome to you all. Welcome to On Dementia, Care, Community, and Creativity, a conversation with Lynn Casteel Harper. My name is Marigrace Becker, and I'm the Program Manager for Community Education and Impact at the University of Washington's Memory and Brain Wellness Center, and I'll be moderating today. This event is first in a series of 3 conversations with leaders in elder care who have published books in 2020 that challenge our assumptions around dementia and provide a deeper understanding of how to support persons living with dementia, their care partners, and their community. Presented by the Frye Art Museum, the University of Washington's Memory and Brain Wellness Center, and Aging Wisdom, the series also honors the 10-year anniversary of the Frye Art Museum's creative aging programs, which are being celebrated with their exhibition, Art on the Mind. I would like to begin by acknowledging the land on which we gather, which is the traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Duwamish and Squamish tribes, who have since time immemorial stewarded the lands and waters of this place we now call Seattle. Please join me in offering gratitude and respect to their elders, past and present, as well as future generations for their stewardship. A few housekeeping items before we get started. Today's event will last 1 hour. The first part will be a conversation with the author, interspersed with readings from the book, and we'll save the last 15 minutes or so for your questions. Note that we're all automatically on mute during this webinar, so if you'd like to interact along the way, please use that chat button to type comments or questions to others, or if you have a question that you'd like the author to respond to at the end, you can put it into the Q&A button as well. We'll be pulling from the Q&A for questions at the end. Note that those buttons might be in different places around your screen, whether you're joining from a computer or a tablet or your phone. So kind of keep looking around the edges and you should be able to find both chat and Q&A. We do have live captions available today. You can simply choose the button that says closed caption and then select whether you'd like to view them as a subtitle or a full transcript. Note that with this webinar format, only the panelists' faces are visible, so nobody else will be able to see your face. We will be recording the event for future viewing. Now, let's take a moment to see how each of us may be connected to the topic of dementia. You'll see a multiple choice question pop up on your screen. Please select your response. And note if you choose other, you can provide more information in chat. There it is. Okay. All right. So a great number of us have been in that role or are currently in that role of caring for a loved one with dementia. A number of us work or volunteer with folks with dementia. A few of us here today live with dementia or have no connection as of yet. I'm seeing comments up there in the chat as well regarding folks' other connections today. Thank you, everyone, for sharing. I'd now like to provide just a little context about the book that we'll be exploring today on Vanishing. Expanding our understanding of dementia beyond progressive vacancy and dread, On Vanishing provides encouragement and meaningful examples of better ways of caring for and thinking about our fellow human beings. Weaving together personal stories with theology, history, philosophy, literature, and science, the book confronts our elemental fears of disappearance and death, drawing on the author's experiences with people living with dementia, both in the American healthcare system and within her own family. It is a rich and startling work of nonfiction that reveals cognitive change as an essential aspect of what it means to be mortal. Now, it is my great pleasure to welcome to our virtual stage today, Lynn Casteel Harper, minister, chaplain, essayist, and author of On Vanishing. Her work has appeared in Kenyon Review Online, North American Review, and Catapult Magazine. She is a Barbara Deming Fund grant recipient and the winner of the 2017 Orison Anthology Prize in Nonfiction. She lives in New York City and is currently the Minister of Older Adults at the Riverside Church. Welcome, Lynn.
Thank you, Marigrace. Thank you for having me. It's just such a delight to be here. And I just want to thank all the hosts and for the 167 people who are here who've taken time out to, I know we have a lot of choices these days where to be. So I'm humbled people are here today for this conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. And I'm so delighted to have you kick off our series. And as you know, I've been following your work for quite some time. First, reading a blog post of yours on dementism, and then since then, keeping track on essays and things that you've been writing. But when your book came out, I was so thrilled to read it and just really, really appreciate what you've done to help us all begin to reframe what it can mean to live with dementia. So to kick things off, I'm wondering if you could share a bit about your own story with dementia and what drew you to write this book.
Like so many of you who were polled, dementia is something very personal to me. It's part of my family history. I have a strong genetic link, really on both sides of my family. It's strong. My grandfather struggled with Alzheimer's disease in the last decade of his life, and so was very close for our family. At the same time, my grandfather was deepening into dementia. My professional life was bringing me into working closely with people living with dementia on a dementia unit at a nursing care facility. And I remember very distinctly, this was my first job out of divinity school after chaplaincy training in a hospital. And on my first day at this retirement community, I was brought to the facility, the nursing facility, and given a tour by an administrator. A perfectly kind, loving person took me to each floor. And when we got to the dementia unit on the fourth floor, I remember him saying, "You probably won't spend much time here." And the message that was subtle and not so subtle was that these people are so gone, in a sense, that it's best to spend your time with people who will recognize you and know that you've come. With 200 people under your care, go to those people who will most appreciate your visit. And I think he was just simply reflecting the larger cultural attitude that these people with dementia are so forgetting, or they're forgotten, that we should just go ahead and disappear from them as well. And at the time, it struck me something didn't feel right about that. And what I found is that I actually spent most of my time on the dementia unit. And the people who on that day appeared sort of this blur of disability became individuals. And individuals who were so vital and had so many gifts to give and who wanted to love and be loved and all the things that I want, that we want. And so I think that dissonance encapsulated, crystallized in that moment is what led me to want to write this book. I want to address this dissonance between what society says dementia is and people with dementia are, and what actually is and what could be. So I think that's the kernel that really drove me to the page.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's interesting to hear both the threads of personal connection as well as professional connection, even going very back to the beginning of your career there as a chaplain, and some of that contrast and dissonance between what you're being told, is important, or what to value in a person versus your own experience there. I'm curious if you'd go ahead and read just a portion of your introduction for us, which I think also gets at that first question topic.
Sure, I'd be delighted to. I guess it's appropriate, since this is at the Frye Art Museum, it starts with a painting from the Metropolitan Art Museum. So
very.
With Vanishing on my mind, I crossed Central Park to the Metropolitan Museum of Art on a late autumn morning on a sober errand. Ginkgo leaves, freshly fallen, coated my path. My root word research on vanishing, which like vanity comes from the Latin evanescere, die away, and vanis, empty void, had led me to a genre of still life painting that flourished in the Netherlands in the early 17th century. The Vanitas school of painting takes its name from the Latin version of an Ecclesiastes refrain: vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And it involves carefully juxtaposing objects deemed symbolic of life's brevity and the evanescence of earthly achievements. Objects such as mirrors, broken or tipped glassware, books, decaying flowers, and skulls are meant to encourage viewers to contemplate their own mortality. Jacques Deguen's Vanitas still life, the earliest known Vanitas painting, hangs in one of the Met's seemingly less popular galleries. Most visitors pass through this corridor of dark, still life paintings on their way to lighter, more moving pieces. That autumn morning, I had Vanitas still life to myself. A modest-sized piece, it contains a panoply of Vanitas symbols. A thin stream of vapor rises from an urn. An orange flower with browning leaves languishes in another. Dutch medals and Spanish coins glitter in the foreground. Two philosophers, Democritus, the laughing philosopher, and Heraclitus, the crying philosopher, recline in the painting's top corners, pointing to the objects below. A large, transparent bubble hovers over a human skull. From every angle, the viewer confronts images of life's transience. But it is the skull that serves as the central reminder of human vanishing. The empty eye sockets locked my gaze, making me think vainly of my own future. A hollowed head, more than any other bodily remnant, symbolizes death's totality, an unyielding force that consumes the entire person, even the ability to think. I guess there's a reason why the sight of Yorick's skull, not his rib cage or pelvic bone, occasions Hamlet's famous lament. As a condition associated with the head, dementia, like the Vanitas skull, ignites an especially acute awareness of mortality, placing our very selves under death's scrutiny. In the last decade, I've glimpsed dementia from several different angles. I've seen dementia-related deaths in my own family. I've worked with dementia sufferers day to day in my capacity as a nursing home chaplain. I recently discovered that both of my parents carry one copy of ApoE4, a gene variant strongly linked to late-onset Alzheimer's disease. I have a 50% chance of having a single copy of the gene, which doubles or triples my risk of developing the disease. I have a 25% chance of having two copies, which elevates my risk by 8 to 12 times. My particular bloodlines aside, the chance of getting Alzheimer's disease, the most common form of dementia, is 1 in 9 after age 65 and 1 in 3 after age 85. Nearly 6 million people in the United States are living with Alzheimer's, making it the nation's 6th leading cause of death. And yet, nuanced thinking about dementia is largely absent, perhaps even non-existent in public discourse. Heart disease impairs circulation. Kidney disease impairs filtration, but brain disease impairs communication. By distinctly and directly impacting our abilities to relate with ourselves and others, it confronts us with the fact of our humanness. To be human is to be limited, even in our most cherished capacities. Perhaps more than other conditions, dementia brings our fundamental lack of ultimate control over our lives and their endings to a head. Rather than confirming the humanness of sufferers, dementia, curiously, is often viewed as throwing it into question. A gerontologist once told me over lunch that he begins his dementia caregiver workshops by telling participants that their loved ones remain persons throughout their illness. He reminds caregivers that even as their relatives become more inaccessible, their core never leaves. I'm glad for his admonition. I'm also troubled that it is needed. I doubt caregivers of persons with terminal heart disease need such instruction, or caregivers of infants need reminders that even though their babies cannot talk or use the bathroom, they remain people. That we need reminders that persons living with dementia are still people elevates my curiosity and my suspicion about the peculiar burdens dementia-causing diseases bear. We seem to have placed dementia beyond the scope of ordinary human imagining, as if this condition alone reveals some nasty, shameful secret, the ease with which we all may disappear.
Mhm. Thank you, Lynn. Thanks for that reading. It does bring to mind a lot for me working in a specialty memory clinic where we do see a lot of folks, diagnosed for the first time, or right there at the minute of diagnosis, and how people grapple with it and what all it brings up, what it brings to mind, which, like you said, that peculiar burden, peculiar fear, peculiar shame we have for things associated with changes within our brain, which isn't there with changes in other parts of our body. I definitely heard people say that, like, why? I feel ashamed, but why should I be ashamed? I wouldn't be ashamed if I had a knee injury or a back injury, but noting that sense around a cognitive change that brings out something different. And it also makes me think of the orientation class we lead for folks who are newly diagnosed. And one question people often are thinking through is, do I tell other people or not? Which again, gets at that shame piece of, like, do we have to wonder about whether to tell someone else about any other medical condition? So I am really,
Yeah, I can remember with my grandfather, telling one of my friends, a minister friend, that his condition had progressed such that now he was living in an assisted living, memory care. And I remember she said, "Oh, so he's gone." And, I thought, what other condition could we say that, because someone's experiencing some diminishment, that they're gone from life. And we start to hear that everywhere we turn, but I think there's other ways for us to enter into this experience other than just calling people gone or vanished.
Right. Yeah. I heard yesterday a person in a group shared, she just been in another group with persons with dementia, and she said, one person said, "I'm equally alive. I'm equally alive." Mm-hmm. We're all equally alive. I like that counter. Well, on the topic of disappearance, I'm wondering if you might talk with us about the title of your book, On Vanishing, and why you think the language and metaphors we use around dementia are so important.
So I chose On Vanishing, that particular metaphor, because it's one, like we were just saying, we hear so often swirling in our ear. It's in the New York Times, it's in the media, this language of gone, people have disappeared, they've vanished, they're suffering the long goodbye, the long funeral, the death that leaves the body behind. They're fading, their shells, their husks. The language, we could just go on and on. And what is so problematic about it? On one hand, yes, there's loss, and I'm not trying to say there isn't, that there's not loss of certain capacities. But the suggestion with this vanishing language is that the person as person is fading or disappearing. And that becomes a problem because then we treat people the way we imagine people is the way we treat people. So if we imagine them as sort of half-filled or sort of ghost-like people, then treatment reflects that. We know that people with dementia suffer mistreatment at a much higher level than their peers. And so language has real consequences. So in one sense, I want to push back against this idea that people are vanishing. No, like your friend just said, we're equally alive. We're not vanishing. And on the other hand, I want to say, well, aren't we all vanishing? Aren't we all experiencing change and loss in our lives? Limitations, finitude, and then the great thing that we'll all head toward is death. So it's not just about them, it's about all of us. And so that's why I found that vanishing metaphor so something I really wanted to latch on and work with. And this idea that we are part of this story. And it's not just them.
Yeah. That is interesting that one metaphor can both be a way of kind of stigmatizing or disappearing a certain subset of the population, but also it is a metaphor that can become a way of including all of us at the same time. That's really interesting. Well, I know that your relationship with your grandfather, Jack, had a large impact on you from reading your book. In your reflections on somebody vanishing or not vanishing makes me think about a passage in your book regarding that aspect of your grandfather. I'm wondering if you might go ahead and read to us about him.
Sure, absolutely. And this is a little briefer than the first one. So. For all of his losses in old age, I've come to feel that my grandfather, Jack, as Jack, did not vanish. He persisted, a complex conglomeration of the past and his new present. Jack would mock sing into a salt shaker when good music came on in the nursing home dining room. What else but an affinity for life was behind the enjoyment of playing instruments, traveling the world, perfecting omelets, and singing into a salt shaker? Stooping over his wife's coffin deep in dementia, Jack said, "I don't want to join you yet, babe." What else but a will to survive was behind piloting a cargo plane across the treacherous Burmese hump, scraping his way through medical school, playing gigs in bars at night, and declaring at my grandmother's graveside his desire to live? The essences behind his previous life endeavors seemed intact in Jack until the end, in subtle shades, often known only to those who spent time with him, while the activities that once embodied them had fallen away. The mystics might say what is left is a truer, purer self, the dissolving of all doing, the stripping away of the via activa, makes straight the path for the naked, beloved self to emerge. The destruction of ego can facilitate a new freedom of being.
Thank you. He sounds like quite the vibrant person.
He certainly was. And, just to be able to, with this book, spend time thinking about him, and not in the ways that we often do, with our loved ones. We sort of lionize a certain part of their life, so I could have focused on his heroics in World War II or his medical practice, but to really think about him in his later years as worth lifting up. And I remember doing a funeral for someone who had died of dementia, and the family didn't want to talk about those years, as if that last decade, nothing had happened. And, I think that's common, that we want to cling to something more known that we can lift up. And it takes a little more work to begin to see some of the beauty in the life and these other experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes me think about a memorial I attended for a man that I had known in an adult day program for quite a while, and I only knew him once he had dementia. but yeah, I always thought of him. He was the person where you'd walk into the room and he basically loved everything. Anything that was happening, he loved it. He'd say, I love the banjo. I love this tea. I love you. I love puppies. I love, anything that was being discussed. He loved it. He was like effusive with love. And I really enjoyed being around him. And when he passed at his funeral, I remember his wife came to me and said, "I'm so sorry you never knew Joe." And it was so striking to me because I had spent multiple years with him in that adult day program, and I was like, wait. And then it struck me very deeply, thinking like, okay, I didn't know I didn't know how he was before he had dementia, but I definitely knew someone named Joe that was a really amazing person to know. Mm-hmm. But I think it can be so complicated when the person you've known for a long time is shifting. It can be so complicated to kind of let loose of what has been or what has been known, and to accept or get to know who's there in front of you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. How do we tell those untold stories with sensitivity, that we're not eliminating suffering or downplaying it, but we are lifting up stories that are other than the tragedy narrative.
Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But there can be more there. Well, in your book, you share a number of ways that your heart or mind has been open, touched, or surprised through encounters with people with dementia, whether with your grandfather Jack, like you just mentioned, or others. How have these encounters shaped your perspective or your work as a minister?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really can't imagine my life as a person and as a minister without having encountered dementia, disability, aging, people living through significant challenges with a lot of creativity, a lot of grit, and a lot of love. So, I just feel tremendously blessed, enriched, grateful to have found myself in the path of dementia. And I'll say it's taught me, at least to try to let go of my sense of needing to control everything. That I don't have to keep it all together in order to be loved. That my value is not related to solely what I can produce intellectually or monetarily or economically, that there's something deeper, that working with people where there's no more pretense that you have it all together, that everything's under control, that you're the rugged individual who can overcome all obstacles. These are cherished cultural narratives that are punctured with dementia. And being in those worlds is, I think, helping me become a better person, become more compassionate, open, hopefully spontaneous, have a little more sense of humor about life. So I'm just so grateful. And I think another thing, and Marigrace, you and I have talked about this before, the idea of being with instead of fixing people. And that translates to ourselves too. We learn how to be with the uncomfortable parts of who we are without needing to be aggressive about it and fix everything. And I'm learning that. And it's a very spiritual process, this kind of letting go and trusting.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Appreciate that. Touching on, you just mentioned it's a very spiritual process. A lot of the themes that you mention and explore in your book, things around what does it mean to be human, what gives us value, what gives life meaning, a lot of those are explored within the world's spiritual traditions or philosophical traditions. Now, knowing that you have a background as a minister and chaplain, I'm curious how your particular faith tradition has played into or impacted or shaped your perspectives on some of those questions in your work with people with dementia.
Absolutely. I think when my spiritual antenna is working correctly, and I say when, it's not always or if, um, when a group is being discounted or dismissed, my faith tradition as a Christian and a social justice tradition of Christianity, lots of different threads of Christians, uh, it asks why. And it also recommends that this shouldn't be. It says more about those who exclude than those who are excluded. And so for resources for me start really in Genesis with being created in the image of God. And so humans, I believe, are created with a divine imprint. And that's not something that can rise or fall on cognitive ability or physical ability, any ability. It's not abilities based. It just is a fact of creation that we're loved and part of God's family, period. And so that's the first kind of counter narrative in a culture that often tells us we have to earn everything we get. And so that's for me, an important narrative. And the other, well, there's several touchstones, but one I'll just mention is when Jesus says to care for the least of these in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, talks about when you do this to the least of these, you've done it unto me. And so the idea that those who are most vulnerable, sick, in need, when we as a community and individual offer care with those people, we're actually offering care to Christ for a Christian. So it's not just a nice thing we do for these sick people. It's not paternalistic, that it's actually this radical notion that you're serving Christ's self. So for me, that's a real flip, and it's a counter narrative. What power looks like. Power looks like care. Power looks like compassion. And that's how we live in community in a beloved way. And so for me, faith is at the center of that. But I know people can come at love and community and compassion so many different ways and with different stories and different traditions. But for me, that's been very central.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Appreciate that. Really interesting to hear how your tradition has impacted your perspective. Let's go ahead and move into another reading. You were sharing before about how your experiences with people with dementia have really impacted you and shaped your perspectives. I'm curious if you might read to us around that from chapter 7 in your book.
Absolutely. I love introducing people to Evelyn. On one of my first memories of Evelyn, a resident at the Gardens, was on Election Day 2012. She was in her wheelchair watching CNN in the common living room down the hallway from her assisted living apartment. "I will be voting for that man," she declared, pointing to Barack Obama on the television screen. She could not recall his name, but she recognized it when I said it. Despite her growing forgetfulness, she insisted on getting to the polls. A former math teacher, she had been the head of her teachers' union and a card-carrying Democrat, she said. I appreciated Evelyn's sense of citizenship and pride in her vocation, and how she would, as I mentioned at the beginning of the book, inquire how my students were faring. As her dementia deepened, Evelyn moved from her assisted living apartment to the dementia unit, where she often sat alone in her wheelchair by the nurse's station. Sometimes she calmly passed the time, and sometimes she anxiously beseeched passersby. On one midwinter day when I greeted Evelyn, she asked me to help her get to this street so she could get home. Her steely blue eyes were wide and urgent, her shoulders high and tense. She tightly gripped the sides of her wheelchair. She didn't want to keep her mother waiting, she explained. I told her how bitter cold it was outside, and it was. and proposed that we go to her room down the hallway for now so we could visit. Although she would have preferred my help getting to her mother, she agreed to the suggestion. I walked alongside her as she wheeled her chair down the long hallway. As we approached her room, I noticed a paper with "About Me" in boldface across the top, posted inside a shadow box on the wall outside her door. The paper contained a photograph of a smiling Evelyn and a few paragraphs about her life. For want of a better idea, I read the sheet aloud. I learned that she was born in 1919, which made her 95 years old at the time. She was active in her local Catholic parish and grew up in a large, tightly knit Irish family. She had never married, and her dearest friend was her cousin Boo. I learned more about her union activity and her long tenure at the high school where she had taught. After I finished reading, I looked back to Evelyn, who was staring fixedly into my face, her eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you," she said. "That makes me feel good." She paused and then opined, "It's lonely when no one knows you." "Yes, it is lonely sometimes," I said. Recalling her initial intent when I encountered her, I added, "I bet you miss your mother, Evelyn." "Oh, yes," she responded emphatically. "Do you miss your mother?" In what I can only describe as an act of pure presence, of generous reciprocity, she looked in my eyes and awaited a response. Residents at the nursing home rarely asked me questions, let alone one so emotionally pointed. Usually the question asker, I seldom offered glimpses into my personal life, a protective position I found comfortable. Evelyn's tender spontaneity, her unguarded curiosity, disarmed me. "Do I miss my mother?" she wanted to know. At the time, I lived 1,000 miles from my mother, so I did not see her often. I did, in fact, miss her, which I had never outright admitted to myself or anyone else. After living far from my family for over a decade, I had grown accustomed to distance. Evelyn loosened me from grown-up sophistication, from playing the mature adult who had gained geographical and emotional independence. A lump of sadness pressed against my chest and tightened my throat. She identified an ache within me, one I had not recognized until that moment. This was about me, too. "Yes, I do," I replied. Evelyn offered a knowing nod. The source of her urgency and sadness became palpable to me. Imagine, she had not seen her mother for a very long time. And no one ever gets over being orphaned, not at any age. No one stops searching for home or for her mother. My conversation with Evelyn was not just what it seemed. It was not simply a woman confused about the year and the whereabouts of her long-deceased mother. I recognized something deeper in her yearning. She recognized something hidden in me.
What a beautiful story of mutual relationship.
Yeah, I just go back to gratitude, just the grace in those moments and the idea that there can be reciprocity, but it may look different.
Right, right. Well, Lynn, we just have a few more minutes for our conversation, but I do want to get to that topic of fear, which I think runs throughout your book as well. You talk about our dementia-phobic culture and grappling with your own fear of dementia. And in writing the book, you seem to attempt to explore and move beyond the fear, inviting us all and helping us to do the same. What would you say are themes in your book that can most help us shift out of that fear-based perspective, either individually or as a wider culture?
Yeah, I think fear sort of constricts us. It limits our imagination. it limits our sense of options or a future. And so I want to always grapple with fear, not that we can ever overcome it or vanquish it. I don't think that's the point. It's to recognize it, to work with it, to name it, so that it doesn't have so much power over us. And so I hope that with my book, that we can kind of take dementia out of this hyper fear, othering kind of language and bring it down to earth a little bit. That people with dementia, that dementia itself kind of joins the spectrum of human experience that we're all on. We don't fall off of it when certain abilities diminish or go away, but that we're on this kind of path together. And so my hope is that by telling some of these untold stories, by lifting up some of the metaphors that maybe are damaging and maybe have some possibilities, that we can begin to kind of move together into a more gentle tomorrow, a gentler world on which, to land when we find ourselves facing these kinds of limitations. And so that's my hope with fear, that we'll find a different path through it that doesn't lead to stigmatizing ourselves or others.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I love that imagery of all of us being on the spectrum of human experience, that it can look so different and we're all on that spectrum. Thank you. Well, I was going to ask kind of what you're hoping we take away from the book, and you touched on that just then, but perhaps you could read to us a few more paragraphs from your introduction in a way of answering that question of kind of what are your hopes that we take away from this book and even from this session?
Sure. I heard a woman describe her spouse with dementia as my gone, but not gone husband. And her phrase seemed to strike at the heart of dementia's paradoxes, an acute awareness of absence and an equal insistence on presence. Lately, I'm struck by its general relevance as I consider my own gone and not gone self, the cells that comprise my body, all of our bodies, routinely break down or slough off, and new ones take their place. Some cells, like neurons, die and are never replaced. Paradox lives at the heart of my faith, too. The gone and not gone ego, the gone and not gone Jesus. The play of presence and absence infuses all of life, I think, both before and after dementia. Maybe if we can learn to inhabit this tension, this space between opposites, then dementia and the lives it touches can rejoin the spectrum of human experience, rather than being reduced to tired tropes and burdened by outsized fears its sufferers and caregivers made to disappear. Imagine if we received all lives, those with and without dementia, as conglomerations of the ordinary and the peculiar, the fragmented and the whole, the present and the vanishing.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lynn. Thank you for sharing from your book and also so many of your perspectives. I hope this gives folks just a taste of On Vanishing and the desire to go ahead and read the full book. I'm going to now go ahead and open it up for Q&A. And again, just a reminder that if you do have a question for Lynn, you can press on that Q&A button and type it there. We have just 15 minutes or so I don't think we'll get to all the questions, but we'll hope to touch on a few of them at least. And Lynn, I'm going to start with this one. Could you speak to the value of beginning to normalize discussion related to dementia as a society? The woman asking the question says, I'm 70. I was the daughter in town for both parents who experienced dementia. I understand the toll it takes. But I see how a majority of dementia talk among my peers is spoken out of veiled fear. There's an avoidance to speak honestly about how we might begin to prepare ourselves and to prepare those close to us for such a stage of our life. I wanted to pose this question to you because I know you have a chapter in your book that's a bit provocative as far as how the language you use to talk about potential dementia in the future of your life and how that could shift things. But would you like to take that one on?
Sure, that's a really great question. How do we do this in our daily lives? And I mean, for one thing, I just applaud these kind of forums. I don't know if this would be 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that we're having these discussions that aren't just about disease stages and fear, tragedy narratives. I think, the chapter you're referring to, Marigrace, I talk about, for me, I say when I have dementia instead of if. I talk about it as if it's going to be part of my future, not because I wish that or have some kind of, fatalistic view, but just to talk about it, to kind of normalize it, to where the psychological barriers aren't quite so high. I think if we can begin to tell our stories in different ways, whether that's in our friendship circles or whatever spheres of influence we have, whether that's on social media, with our families, whether we work for organizations where we write newsletters, or speak at conferences, or wherever we find ourselves. If we can just put different frames around the subject every chance we get, that doesn't mean we call out people. I think rather we call in people. We call in people to tell the stories that they didn't even know they had. And so I'm always asking that question. And for the person who asked the question, who's been a caregiver, I guarantee you have so many stories to share. And I invite you to find ways to share those. And no way is too small. No, that over tea, over coffee conversations. I just encourage people to start taking a risk and share them.
Thank you. It ties in a bit with another question someone posed. They said, in my experience, people find it easier to support those, quote unquote, battling cancer or other diseases from which they may recover, but struggle to maintain relationships with those living with dementia. There's not necessarily a recovery. To me, those who vanish are not the ones with dementia, but rather their friends and community who disappear after their once cherished friend cognitively declines. How can we help others see that their loved one remains a person and very much the person they've always known? So I guess thinking about translating the perspectives in your book and thinking about the many, many, many family caregivers here in our midst that are maybe wanting to help friends and family stay connected with their loved one and to see them as the person they are. Do you have any thoughts on how to forge those or maintain those connections or help others stay connected with your loved one?
Mm-hmm. And Marigrace, I know you do this every day in your work, so you may have thoughts on that too. With the story I read about, I call her Evelyn in the book. That very simple about me poster she had outside her door. It may have seemed like the most simple thing in the world for her family to put up, but it was really life changing. And so I think if we can tell stories, and communities do that, in a faith community, which is the context I come in, we're always telling stories, ancient stories, over and over and over again. If we can begin to lift up those stories of who the person not only was, but is, whatever those threads may be, that we don't, I guess, give in to the other narratives, and that we offer portals of connection for people who are maybe struggling to connect. And so it might be that we help people prime a question, or prompt a story for someone, or use photographs or music, or a familiar poem or prayer, that we give people kind of tools, like little touchstones, to connect with those we love.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you. Here's another question. When my husband forgot our conversations, he was without ego in the moment of bringing it up again, but I felt erased. It was hard for me to let go of my own ego. And I'm curious if you might speak to that feeling of one's own self vanishing, like feeling if you're not being recognized, am I, feel that sense of, now I'm gone, and that distress around that. How can we kind of move through that very common, I think, feeling of distress?
Yeah. Thank you for having the courage to name that, because so much of what we attach as care is remembering. So if I forget your name in normal conversation, that can be interpreted as I don't care. I don't care about you be enough to recall your name. And so from a very young age, we're taught that our memory reflects our care for someone. And when our memories change, it's hard to disassociate a sense of feeling cared for when recall diminishes. And so if we can look for those other points where care is evident, and not to say that's not easy, it's tremendously difficult, but reframing care is care the fact that your husband asked you the question again and respected you enough to want to know your opinion or thought, that he felt comfortable enough or familiar enough, loved enough to to care enough to ask again. So I guess it requires a lot of reframing, and I think it requires being in a community that's loving and compassionate and supportive.
Thank you. Here's a question. I'm not sure if you have background on folks with traumatic brain injury, but there was a question from someone saying, I see many shared challenges between dementia and brain injury, that sense of before and after and vanishing, etc. Do you see many connections between these two in your work?
I don't know if I can speak a lot about traumatic brain injury, although I did work for a time in a hospital and saw some of that. I think anytime we're dealing with change of cognition, there's going to be overlap. Anytime we're dealing with intellectual or cognitive disability, there's going to be some common themes, even if the experiences aren't exactly the same. And so I think there's overlap. There's things we can pull forward and say, no, you're not vanishing, even as you've changed after this traumatic injury. That we're still your friends and we will continue to be your friends, no matter where this change and radically altered maybe personality or whatever takes you, that this community, we're still going to hold you. So I think there is some overlap there, and I'm glad you brought that up.
Thank you. Question about tapping into your experience being with people in later stages of dementia as a chaplain. What ideas do you have for me spending time with my mother in the late stage of Alzheimer's?
Well, I always say you are the expert. You know your mother better than anyone. You know yourself. Sit with that. Trust yourself. Love yourself. Be gentle with yourself. There's no getting it right or wrong. That your loving spirit and you're trying to connect is worthwhile and sacred. That said, I always find nature, bringing in the natural world, engaging the senses, whether that's flowers or plants or a leaf, using music, ways to connect beyond needing to come up with the correct answer or to recall is always really important. And it can be very simple. And just because something's simple doesn't mean it's simplistic. And to honor that. And silence is okay. I learned that from one of the daughters who said, I offer my mother companionable silence. And I thought, what a phrase. Companionable silence is okay and
That's nice.
good. Mhm.
Hmm. Lovely. One person asked, how would I know that I'm already suffering from dementia and, in quotes, vanishing? I can maybe just speak to that briefly, that it's something that you could chat with your primary care doctor about if you're feeling that you're noticing some changes with your memory or with your thinking that are different from what you've experienced in the past, and you're feeling concerned. It's a conversation you could absolutely bring to your primary care doctor, and they should be able to help you figure that out. Maybe we'll end on this. How you might want to respond to it. One of the almost comforting parts for me as a caregiver for my mom after being diagnosed with Alzheimer's was that we didn't have to hold on to hope for a cure. I wonder if that lack of hope for a cure, but holding on to hope for good days, is a way to reframe the experience. What would you say to that, Lynn?
Oh, that's so beautiful. I think you've done it. One of my favorite writers and theologians, Henry Nouwen, talks about shifting from cure to care. Now, he's not talking about Alzheimer's disease, but just our general orientation in life. If we can shift from needing to cure, which is a form of control and fix, to care, which is a much more broadly human experience, that can bring with it a form of healing. And I think what this person has shared is so beautifully doing that, holding on to those moments, living presently and in the day.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Lynn, and thank you for all the effort that went into writing that book to begin with and helping us to begin imagining new ways of perceiving dementia. Thank you again to the presenting organizations, the Frye Art Museum, the UW Memory and Brain Wellness Center, and Aging Wisdom, and thank you to you all for attending.